All of his victims were young, vulnerable Black women who lived in South Los Angeles and most struggled with drug addiction. In the 1980s, an unknown killer was leaving a wake of bodies in neighborhoods, in alleyways, hidden under garbage and debris. All of his victims were sexually assaulted, then shot at close range with a .24 caliber pistol, strangled, or both. The city called him the Grimm Sleeper, and it took 23 years before he was identified and captured. Investigators believe that he murdered at least 6 more women, in addition to the 10 women he was convicted of murdering in 2011. Welcome back to Sunday Solves, where I bring you a case that proves even the passage of time won't stop justice. Before we dig into who he was, I want to first acknowledge his victims and their deaths. This will also quickly establish the clear pattern investigators were able to use to connect these cases. Deborah Jackson, 29, was a cocktail waitress who left her friend's house August 10, 1985 in Linwood and went to take the bus back home to her apartment in South Central Los Angeles. Her body would be discovered with 3 gunshots to the chest 4 days later. Henrietta Wright, 35, was found deceased August 12, 1986 in a South Los Angeles alley. She was shot twice in the chest and found barefoot, wrapped in a blanket and covered with a mattress. Barbara Ware, 23, was found deceased January 10, 1987. Her body was found under a pile of trash in an alley and she had been shot once in the chest. Bernita Sparks, 26, told her mother April 15, 1987 that she needed to go to the store to get cigarettes, but never returned. She was found the following day in a trash bin covered in garbage. She had been beaten, strangled, and shot in the chest. Mary Lowe, 26, was last seen on Halloween night, 1987. She told her mother she was going to a party, and her body would be found the following day in an alley. She had been shot once in the chest. Latricia Jefferson, 22, was found January 30th, 1988, shot in the chest and left in the alley. Alicia Alexander, 18, asked her father whether he needed anything from the liquor store on September 11th, 1988, and her body would be found 4 days later in an alley. Police say she had been sexually assaulted and shot in the chest. Princess Bertha Mew, 15, disappeared December 21st, 2001. They would find her remains March 19th, 2002. She was found in an alley. She had been strangled and beaten, and the DNA on her body matched the DNA left on the bodies of other victims. This was the first body with DNA matching the other victims in over 13 years. Valerie McCovery, 35's remains were found in an alley on July 11, 2003. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. They initially suspected her boyfriend until the DNA on her body was found to match other victims. Janicia Peterson, 25's remains were found January 1, 2007. She had been shot in the back and placed in a garbage bag. Anishria Washington was the only known survivor of the Grimm Sleeper. She was sexually assaulted and shot November 1988 and managed to escape. Who was the Grimm Sleeper, and how was he finally caught? His name was Lonnie Franklin, and he was a married former Army corporal who also worked as a Los Angeles City trash collector and a garage attendant for the Los Angeles Police Department station. Lonnie grew up in the neighborhoods where he hunted his victims. At the time, the community in South Central had a reputation in the 80s of escalating gang activity and drug problems. The murder rates were at an all-time high, and Lonnie clearly saw this as a perfect time to take advantage and began murdering women in plain sight. Friends and neighbors believed that Lonnie was a regular guy. He had a wife and 2 kids. He was known as a good mechanic in the neighborhood and would fix your car for cheap. What his neighbors didn't know is that he had an arrest record with a history of sexual violence going back into the 70s. In 1974, when he was stationed at Stuttgart, Germany as a private in the U.S. Army, Lonnie and 2 other men kidnapped and sexually assaulted a 17-year-old girl. During this attack, him and the other soldiers took pictures while attacking this woman, and this is an action that Lonnie would continue to repeat when he began killing women in the 80s. The 3 men would be arrested and charged on 2 counts of theft, 1 count of misdemeanor assault, and 1 count of battery. And Lonnie would be sentenced to serve less than 1 year and received a general discharge from the Army. The other 2 men did their entire time, and to this day, it is unclear to LAPD why Lonnie was let out earlier than the other 2. Lonnie's first known victim in Los Angeles would be 29-year-old Deborah Jackson, and over the following 3 years, he would kill 6 more victims: Princess, Valerie, Jenica, Henrietta, Barbara, Bernita, Mary, Latricia, and Alicia, shooting all of his victims in the chest and dumping them in the alleyways and covering most of them with trash and debris. The connection to most of these victims from the beginning was that most of them suffered from drug addiction, and a few of them occasionally did sex work to support their habits. Investigators in Los Angeles were really struggling to solve these cases and to connect them all together at the time, because at the same time Lonnie was active, there was also 4 to 5 other serial killers active at the same time in this area. He would be named the Grimm Sleeper because one of his victims in 1988, who he sexually assaulted and intended to murder, escaped and survived, Anitra Washington. And as far as investigators knew, it would be another 13 years before he committed his next known murder. This is why he would be dubbed the Grimm Sleeper, because he had such a violent spree and then went inactive for 13 years. But investigators don't believe that he actually stopped killing at this time. He may have just changed his hunting grounds or his technique, and they were not able to connect those cases. It would be 15-year-old Princess's murder, her nude body found beaten and strangled in an alleyway, and 35-year-old Valerie found strangled in an alleyway and sexually assaulted, that would lead investigators to the horrific realization that the DNA pulled off of those two victims matched their previous victims from the 80s. Investigators had been pulling DNA from the victims and running them through the state and federal offender database for years, but there were never any matches found. Despite the fact that Lonnie had been arrested multiple times for sexual assault and battery, his arrests occurred before California approved a measure that required DNA be taken by felony convicts. Despite investigators' best efforts collecting DNA and running it through the database for years, they decided to turn to what at the time was controversial and a new technique called familiar DNA. They hoped that somebody related to this killer was already in their database. And in 2009, they got an unsuspected break when Lonnie's son, Christopher, who would be convicted on a felony weapons charge in 2009, had his DNA sample taken at his incarceration. When Christopher's DNA was added to the system, they suddenly had a very close match to the DNA they had been chasing. That's when investigators knew that he had to be a very close relative to the Grimm Sleeper. They narrowed it down and decided that it had to be, based on the time frame and the age, Christopher's father. So they began in July 2010 surveilling and watching Lonnie's every move. And on July 5th, 2010, the surveillance team followed Lonnie to a family birthday party at a pizzeria in Orange County. A detective disguised as a busboy would collect a half-eaten piece of pizza, a fork, 2 napkins, 2 plastic cups, and a piece of chocolate cake from Lonnie's table and took them directly to the LAPD's DNA lab for testing. And it was a clear and positive match. Lonnie, now 57, would be arrested on July 7th, 2010 and charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. When investigators did a search of his home, they would find the gun used to kill Janica and a large stash of Polaroids he had taken of his victims. Lonnie's trial began on May 2016, and the jury was presented with a lot of information, to include testimony from his one and only survivor. On top of that, the ballistics evidence and the DNA evidence proved to the jury a conclusive link to each of the 10 murder victims, inevitably leading to a guilty sentence for each of the 10 victims. Lonnie was sentenced to death by lethal injection on August 10th, 2016. However, Lonnie wouldn't make it to his execution, as he was found deceased in his prison cell on March 20th, 2020. It is believed that the 67-year-old died of natural causes. Lonnie thought he knew what he was doing when he picked his victims, believing that they were throwaways that nobody would come looking for. But that wasn't true. Their families fought for their loved ones, and investigators never gave up until they connected every single dot. There has to be some poetic justice to his own son being the final link they needed to stop a monster and bring justice to so many women. Thank you for joining me for another Sunday Solved. I will see you all next Sunday.